Welcome back to the Zelda Game Club. This is where we play through games from the Legend of Zelda series as a Triforce Times Community. So currently playing through the Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past, originally released in 1991. Well, this is part 2 of 3, and today we're in the middle section of the game, where we get the Master Sword and explore the Dark World, having collected the 3 pendants in part 1. Well, today I'm going to cover Hyrule Castle, the Dark Palace, the Swamp Palace Skullwoods, and also the very infamous Gargoyle's Domain. Plus I'm going to pick out some of the community comments sent in by the Triforce Times Community. Well, if you're new around here or find this useful, don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below for all the latest Zelda content and turn on notifications by hitting that bell. Well, before we get into it today, let me know in the comments what you think about A Link to the Past. Whether you're playing it for the first time or the 50th time, I'd love to hear from you and share your thoughts on one of the best Legend of Zelda games of all time. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone in the Triforce Times community who's been playing along with A Link to the Past and this series in the Zelda Game Club. Thank you to everyone who's played and who's been adding their comments onto the videos, and thank you for everyone sending in their comments saying, sorry, I can't play this time, but next time, it's all good. Watching these videos, sharing with a friend or a family, sharing your feedback on how we can make the Zelda Game Club better in the future, that is really what I want to see. If you can play, if you can't play, no worries. It's just really, really good to have you as part of the Triforce Times community. The Zelda Game Club is a community-driven feature, and over time, it is only going to get better. Well, before we get stuck into the detail of part 2, I want to let you know about part 3. So we are now into the home straight, and that means completing the game by Monday the 24th of October 2022 and getting your comments to me on this video. So what I'm going to do is put the final part of the Zelda Game Club for A Link to the Past. I'm going to put that together on Tuesday the 25th. That is a week from today. So get your comments to me about what you think about the final part of the game. So that's the final few dungeons and, of course, that final boss. So get your comments to me by Monday, the 24th of October, 2022. Well, without further delay, let's get into the detail of our adventures in Hyrule with the Zelda Game Club for The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past Part 2. Well, first up, we've got the Master Sword. So we left things off in Part 1 having collected the 3 pendants, and this gave us the ability to pick up the Master Sword. So from Death Mountain, we had to find our way to the Lost Woods, make our way through the Misty Forest and find the Master Sword itself. Getting the Master Sword in any Legend of Zelda game is an epic moment. So, let's take a look at that together right now. Once we have the Master Sword, we are contacted by Princess Zelda, who tells us soldiers are on their way to the sanctuary. So we get there and find a sage on the ground, gravely wounded, and they tell us that Princess Zelda has been taken to Hyrule Castle. Well, at this point, I want to jump over to a community comment, and this one is from BombZeCoffee. So BombZeCoffee says, I've just done the Gargoyle Domain. The most beautiful part of this game is when you pull out the Master Sword and the mist goes away and the sun comes through the forest. The Dark World ain't beautiful, but I do like how creepy it is, although I'd like it if they add sculptors into the Dark World. This game has a lot of items compared to Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, like the boomerang, the bow and arrows, the bombs, and loads more. My favourite item, though, has to be the hookshot, and also the bow and arrow. Well, thank you very much, BombZeCoffee. I have to agree with you there. Getting the Master Sword is a really, really beautiful moment in the game. And I do like the idea of adding these sculptors to the Dark World. That would be a very, very good addition. Maybe one day we're going to get a remake of the game. So imagine a remake of this game in the style of Link's Awakening. I reckon that would be absolutely fantastic. Also, I have to agree with you with your favourite item being the hookshot. I think that is really, really cool too. But thank you once again, BombZeCoffee, for adding in your comment. Really, really appreciate it. And I hope you are enjoying the game. Next up, we got Hyrule Castle. So we've got to battle our way to Hyrule Castle and make our way onto the 2nd floor. Now we've got the Master Sword, we can break the seal and enter. So what we find in front of us is similar to other dungeons in the game, sprawling rooms full of enemies. And eventually we find ourselves face to face with Aghanim. Now, Princess Zelda is unconscious in front of him. He raises his arm, she floats into the air, and he casts a spell, and she's gone. Next time, we have to fight against this powerful wizard, but he can't be harmed directly with the Master Sword, so we have to use his own dark magic against him by deflecting it back with the Master Sword when he tries to attack you. Now, after that fight, Aghanim escapes, but not before teleporting Link to the Dark World first. Well, next up, let's go back to some community comments with Master Knight DH. Well, thank you for writing in, Master Knight DH, and they say, well, for the summary, this is the portion where, although Link gets the Master Sword, things become much harder for him. Between the Dark World living up to its name, with enemies who prove not so easy to evade, and certainly hit harder, with Dactos dealing 3 hearts for particularly annoying enemies to deal with, without taking a hit, and the Light World involving Aghanim's brainwashed shoulders enforcing martial law. Ocarina Boy, who shows up in this segment, is not the only Wooby in this game, and thankfully, in Link's case, helping us by extension, we get some more equipment for actual variety in combat options, even if the sword is going to stay as the reliable option. Well, as for the level design, I'll say that Gargoyle's Domain is my favourite dungeon in the entire game, for its gameplay and story design, actively working with the Thieves element, and also the other dungeons in this part do have their own points. Now, in regards to the bosses, Aghanim and the Helmasaur King are fair. They're balanced fights aside from the latter having a positioning glitch in his transition to the turns red phase. Now, if you don't know about that, but that was patched out in the Game Boy Advance version. But Argus has a reliance on being a puzzle boss, and Mothula is cheaply confounding in general. I definitely have to agree with you there, Master Knight DH. And the Blind Thief has his battle be memorable for questionable reasons, and we're going to get to more about that later on in the episode, without any approach regardless of whether or not you agree he should be on that one boss, and I think he should be. At any rate, the game is doing a really good job of making Link into an Iron Wooby, and there is still more to go. Well, thank you, Master Knight DH. Excellent analysis and comment there. And I have to agree with you, Gargoyle's Domain is an excellent dungeon. We're going to be getting to that later on in the episode. Blind is definitely one of the most outrageous bosses I've ever faced. It seems really unfair in a lot of ways, and if you don't have the magic cape, I'm not really sure how you're going to beat that boss. But thank you to Master Knight DH for the comments, and more from Master Knight later on. So we've made it to the Dark World, and this is really where the difficulty of the game ramps up. The Dark World is a dangerous place, and while it may be similar to the Light World in terms of layout, the enemies hit much harder, so you have to really be careful as Link can die very quickly. So our goal is made very clear early on. We have to save the 7 maidens here in the Dark World to stop the evil wizard from breaking through into the Light World. So the Dark World used to be the Golden Land, but an evil power turned it into the Dark World, and soon that same fate could happen in the Light World too. It's all down to Link to save both worlds, plus the maidens and Princess Zelda along the way. Well, next up, let's have a look at the Dark Palace. So our first port of call is the Dark Palace, and we do get some help from a familiar monkey called Kiki to enter the Dark Palace up in the east of Hyrule. The dungeons in the Dark World, they're much more complicated, including mechanics we learnt in part 1 of the Zelda Game Club, including switches, red and blue blocks, as well as being full of powerful enemies that can take you down very quickly. We're also introduced to a new mechanic in this dungeon which includes enemies and environments that can be affected with the hammer. So there's stakes in the ground and tortoise-like creatures that cannot be harmed with your sword, so you have to pound them with your hammer, flip them over to reveal their soft underbelly, and then you can kill them. Well, before long we find ourselves taking on the boss, the Helmasaur King. This is a large Helmasaur who attacks with his dangerous tail, and it's our job to knock off his protective mask with the hammer so we can attack with the sword. So much like the rest of the dungeon, this boss is a significant step up from the bosses in past dungeons, so it's well worth having a few fairies in some bottles. Once we save the maiden, we understand that Ganon, the boss of thieves, corrupted the Golden Land. This was where the Triforce was hidden, and Ganon wished for the Golden Land to be transformed, and it was turned into the Dark World. So Ganon was behind it all, and Aghanim is just his puppet. Well, no surprises really there that Ganon was behind it all, but let's go back over to a community comment, and let's hear from Master Knight DH once again. So now next on my list is the combat options from the items, and I particularly point to the hammer as a clear case of what you'd expect from the anti-armor melee option. So it's got some speed issues, making sure you can't be careless with your positioning, or you're going to get hit, But this one really hits hard, dealing twice as much damage as the Master Sword's regular attack, or in fact the same damage as the Master Sword's spin attack, without any need to wait for the charge up. So I want to further add that in comparison to other items, the hammer still retains advantages to one extent or another, mostly avoiding MP or ammo consumption, or having raw power in the case of comparison to the boomerang, and also the hookshot too. It helps that unlike the sword, the hammer will not trigger Yomo Medusas introduced in the Swamp Palace, so combine that with the instant pop breaking, and you can see how we have an early 90s game providing TLC to the gameplay by making sure you've got that anti-armor melee option, it never gets fully obsoleted. Well, really good stuff there from Master Knight DH, and thank you so much for going into so much detail. But next up, let's go on over to the journey to the Swamp Palace. So after we leave the Dark Palace, we can pick up a few useful items around Hyrule. We can pick up the shovel, that leads us very quickly to the flute. And if we take the flute to Kakariko Village back in the Light World and play the flute in front of the statue in the town square, a bird breaks out the statue and gives us the ability to fast travel around Hyrule. While the map isn't huge, it does save crucial time, and then we can also make our way to the graveyard and now teleport from the Dark World to the Light World to run into the gravestone to reveal a secret passage. Now here we can find the magic cape, and that allows us to go invisible, and this is really going to come in handy later on. We have to take on tough bosses. Also, we can walk into spikes without getting hurt. We just need to make sure we've got a good supply of magic. The Cane of Burner is another useful item we can pick up, and that surrounds Link in a protective light, as well as doubling up as a weapon. Finally, one of the most powerful weapons in the game is the Bombus Medallion, and that allows us to inflict massive damage on enemies. Once we got all these items, then it's on to the next dungeon. But before we get to the next dungeon, I want to take us over to a community comment, and this one is from Eden8. And then Eden8 says, "I'm glad you're enjoying the game, but in my opinion it's about to get a little frustrating since the difficulty level increases. Getting the Master Sword for the first time is such a good feeling, and defeating Aghanim and gaining access to the Dark World feels just epic. Then, getting transported to the Dark World is so cool, except now you have to be extra careful to avoid hitting enemies, they do a lot of damage. So on top of that, there is a logical progression to beating the dungeons, but you can actually do Skull Woods, Thieves' Town, well that's Gargoyle's domain, and the Palace of Darkness in any order, so long as you're willing to give up on the Titan's Mitt. So there is a little bit more leeway into deciding which dungeons you'd like to go to next. Personally, Palace of Darkness and Swamp Palace are two pretty good dungeons, and they are good challenges to prepare you for the harder dungeons, like Thieves' Town and Skull Woods. The hookshot is really useful in stunning enemies in both, so I'd recommend picking up the Cane of Burner beforehand. Once you've got the mitts, you can pick up the cape, which I recommend before attempting Skull Woods, as it makes the Mothula slightly easier. So if you want to follow the game's intended path, make sure your bottles are filled. Outside of dungeon stuff, I love doing the Dark World overworld stuff, like returning the frog to the smiths after obtaining the mitts, and talking to the flute boy in the Dark World makes me tear up, especially if you go back and play the flute for him. I definitely have to agree with you there, Eden. It is a really sad moment where you have to go back and play that flute for the final time. It's a really good example where the Legend of Zelda can really pull on those heartstrings. But thank you, Eden8, going into loads of detail there and some really excellent analysis. Really enjoyed reading your advice. Well, next up we've got the Swamp Palace, but first of all, we have to flood that palace once again so we can swim around. This dungeon also requires the flippers, so if you haven't got them by now, you have to head back to the Light World and speak to the Zora King and buy those flippers. Yes, they're expensive, but they are necessary and also really worth it too. The Swamp Palace, I think, is an excellent dungeon where we have to modify the water levels to allow us to navigate the dungeon successfully. There's plenty of secret rooms we have to find with bombs with cracks on the wall, plus the Swamp Palace contains one of the most recognisable items in the whole Zelda series, and that of course is the hookshot. This allows us to traverse big gaps in the dungeons as well as attack enemies from range, stunning some enemies. That allows us to get in close and finish them off with the sword. Sometimes water temples in Zelda games can be tricky. I think this one is absolutely excellent, pulling together so many elements from past dungeons. And then you've got the layering on of the water puzzle mechanic. It's one of my favourite dungeons in this game. It's not long before we reach the boss, and this time it's Argus. So this is a giant eye, and he's covered in small little clouds, we've got to use the hookshot to remove each of the small clouds, and then we finish up Argus once his protective shield has gone. And this is really something that I miss from Breath of the Wild, and something I hope they bring back in Tears of the Kingdom. Finding an item in a dungeon, like the hookshot, and then using that item to defeat the boss. So there's so many great things about Breath of the Wild, but it was lacking dungeons and also unique items, and I hope they both make a return. Well, finish the boss, save the maiden, and it's time to make your way to Skull Woods. Well, before we go to Skull Woods, I want to highlight another comment from Master Knight DH. And Master Knight says, and speaking of apparent obsoleting, so this is following on from his previous comment, we've got the comparison between the hookshot and the boomerang. So the way the hookshot behaves, it's commonly treated as a straight up upgrade of the boomerang, already still having the stun ability and the item grabbing in addition to its own intended purpose, as well as the intangibility while it's out, is something not covered by the displaced gamers in the facet of the gem review of the game. However, the boomerang can still be thrown over low obstacles, and it can still be thrown in diagonals, and perhaps most importantly, you can still move while it's out, and the boomerang will return to you like a good faithful friend. Now the big concern is if the boomerang could even do anything post-hookshot that would make it worth bothering with. Well, fortunately, it turns out that it stuns Gibdos where the hookshot doesn't do anything to them. When the hammer actually challenges the Gibdo's already absurd durability as it is, you can see the MP3 way of dealing with the Gibdos efficiently. The hookshot still has its obvious advantages, and the fun factor too, but the boomerang, as it's been one of my favourite items in the game, still proves reasonably useful even later on. Well, thank you, Master Knight DH. That's a very, very interesting point. I've never really thought about it like that before, looking at one item making the other obsolete. I did find myself upgrading the boomerang to the magic boomerang very, very early on, but then I found myself not really using it too much when I got into the Dark World. Although I did find using the boomerang useful for switches in some dungeons, especially throwing it in the diagonal as you described in your comment. Again, thank you for the comment, going into the loads of detail there, really, really appreciate it. And I especially appreciate you sharing your experience with the Triforce Times community. Well, next up, let's go over to Skull Woods. So the next dungeon is Skull Woods, and this is a really unique dungeon, as you can access parts of it by falling through the holes in the woods itself, making Skull Woods actually a part of the dungeon. I found it fairly easy to get lost in this dungeon, plus the enemies here raised up a notch in terms of how beefy they are and how hard they hit. The item in this dungeon is the Fire Rod, which is needed to open the final part of the dungeon to access the boss. While it is a unique dungeon, it doesn't really live up to the high standards of the previous dungeon for me, and to be honest, I think it fell a little flat. But once we make our way through the dungeon, we fight against the boss. This time it is a big moth called Mothula, so this boss can be taken out relatively easily with a Fire Rod. Beat the boss, save the third maiden. Then our next stop is the Dark World version of Kakariko Village, although this time it's called the Village of Outcasts. Well, next up we got Gargoyle's Domain, so this one is a really, really good one. So there's a quick puzzle to get into this dungeon. You have to go to the Village of Outcasts, go to the centre of town, and then pull on the Gargoyle to reveal the staircase down to the dungeon. This is much more like it when it comes to dungeon design in Legend of Zelda games. Once again, it includes many mechanics we've come across before, including the blue and the red switches, although it includes one of the coolest mechanics in the game in my opinion, and that is related to light. So you've got various cracks on the floor, and we have to destroy them with bombs so the sun can shine down to the lower levels. The item in this dungeon is the Titan's Mitt. That allows us to pick up heavier items on the floor, meaning we can now pick up the darker blocks we couldn't budge earlier in the game, allowing us to get to places in Hyrule we couldn't get to before. This dungeon also switches up the formula for finding a boss and saving the maiden. So this time, we find the maiden in a cell and simply open it with the big key. Much like we had to do earlier in the game with Zelda, we have to escort the maiden out of the dungeon. However, it turns out we have to escort her into a room with the light shining down, and she reacts pretty badly to the light and turns into the dungeon boss. So I always like mechanics with light in Zelda games. It takes me back to playing Wind Waker and using the mirror shield. Here it is a great new mechanic, also really, really clever, and managed to change up the mechanics of the game at the right time to keep things feeling fresh. Well, the maiden turns into a boss called Blind, and this boss is absolutely no joke. You're going to most likely need a few fairies to get through this one, plus the magic cape is invaluable as it allows you to attack while you're invisible or until you run out of magic. If you've got a few potions or fairies, then it shouldn't be too long before you defeat the boss, and then you can breathe a sigh of relief. Well, seeing as this is Master Knight DH's favourite dungeon in the game, let's go back over to Master Knight DH as I really want to hear from them to find out what they think. So Master Knight DH says, of course, I do have to talk about Gargoyle's domain actively. As I mentioned, it's my favourite dungeon in the game. It was back when I played A Link to the Past in the 90s, and it still is now. The Zaks are obvious rogues, and I eventually realised that this happens in the gameplay as well, where in a vacuum they would be cookie-cutter enemies, but they're usually encountered in the terrain that interferes with the player, such as below walkways that interfere with vision, in ambushes, or on conveyor belts. The selling point, of course, is the departures from the formula, in that the boss key is obtained early and easy enough to be regarded as some sort of skeleton key. Being able to fight the boss involves a puzzle, where you put the clues together and work with what is available, and the compass even plays a role in the latter by hinting where the fight is supposed to happen, as opposed to its undeveloped role in general, A Link to the Past of just revealing the boss in its obvious location. There's also a nice overworld touch in the building in the northern part of the village of Outcasts being shaped like the upper floor of a dungeon. Suffice to say why I would like this dungeon. And as for Blind the Thief, his fight is unfortunately the low point of Gargoyle's domain in my opinion. You could take him down just using the magic cape, especially against the third phase, but that quickly removes any challenge. There's a bit of overemphasis on the magical shield to block the fireballs from the detached heads, without which it becomes easy to get confused against all the clutter that is still around, even if Blind does prove to be at least learnable, but Blind can also do the occasional laser sniping, which by the way isn't even blockable by the magic shield anyway. And on minimal items and no damage, Blind is about memorization of his pattern quite a bit more than the adaptation on the fly. It does not help that different attacks do not do variable damage against Blind, so offensive skill incentive is damaged. The fight is still functional and better designed than the one with Mothula, but it still has problems that I noticed even back in the day. Well, really excellent stuff there, Master Knight DH. Really appreciate you sharing your opinion and your experience. It's really good to hear that you played A Link to the Past back in the 90s. And also, I'm really sorry that I used the magic cape on Blind. I tried to do it in the traditional way, but I got absolutely creamed. Well, before we go to the wrap-up comment, I want to give a shout-out to CODSTER, who wrote in and said, "Hey Triforce Times, sadly I wasn't able to participate in A Link to the Past Game Club. Been really busy with school, but in the next Game Club, if I can, I would definitely play. So A Link to the Past is one of my favourite games and I wish I could have participated." Well, absolutely no worries, CODSTER, no pressure to join in at all. Really appreciate you watching and also sending in your comment. I hope school isn't too busy, and don't worry about not joining in. You're always more than welcome to join in the future. You're always welcome in the Zelda Game Club. Also want to shout out to Ikana, who said, "Nice video, Triforce Times. Sorry I wasn't able to join in this time around. I just started a new job. I've been really busy the last couple of weeks, so I'm going to try and catch up. But if I'm unable to, I'll definitely be there for the next game. Keep up the good work." Well, thank you, Ikana. So Ikana joined us for the first Zelda Game Club for The Adventure of Link. And I hope that new job is going really well, Ikana, and it'd be good to see you in a future episode of the Zelda Game Club. Well, that is going to be it for the gameplay element of this part 2 in the Zelda Game Club for A Link to the Past. Let me know down in the comments what you think. For part 3, we are now into the home straight. The next step is to finish the game. That means the Ice Palace, Misery Mire, Turtle Rock, and Ganon's Tower. So once again, I'm going to be releasing the next video next Tuesday for part 3, and that is going to be the final part of the Zelda Game Club for A Link to the Past. So it's not too late if you want to start now. The game is about 13 to 15 hours or so, and I reckon you can do that in a week, so if you want to join in, you are more than welcome. If you've enjoyed the Zelda Game Club for A Link to the Past and you want to join in, then complete the game and then add your comments onto this video by Monday the 24th of October 2022. I'm going to be putting together the video for the third and the final part of the Zelda Game Club for A Link to the Past on Tuesday the 25th of October, and also releasing it that same day. So that is a week from today, and good luck and enjoy finishing the game. Well, before we sign off today, I wanted to go through some more development notes about A Link to the Past. First of all, I want to have a look at the music. So the score was composed, arranged and produced by Koji Kondo. The overworld theme of The Legend of Zelda, that's the Hyrule Overture, returns in A Link to the Past, redone in an SMP style. The theme is also featured in Light World Overworld and also in the end credits. A Link to the Past helped establish the musical core of the Zelda series. So while the first game originated the Hyrule Overture, many recurring motifs of the Zelda scores actually come from A Link to the Past, including Zelda's Lullaby, that's Princess Zelda's theme, Ganondorf's theme, Hyrule Castle, that is the royal family theme, Kakariko Village, and you got the select screen or the Fairy Cave. Now, all these themes have been used in subsequent Legend of Zelda games. Well, next up, I want to have a look at the localisation. So the English language localisation included changes to the original Japanese version of the game. The most common change was the removal of religious references to conform with Nintendo of America's content guidelines. The most obvious change was made to the subtitle, which was renamed from Kamigami no Triforce, literally translated Triforce of the Gods, to A Link to the Past. Well, the sanctuary in which Zelda hides is modelled on the Christian chapel, with rows of pews, stained glass windows, and a raised chancel and an altar, but it contains no overt religious symbols, and the dialogue of the characters within it was simplified to remove any religious implication. The font used to represent the unreadable language Hylian originally had designs of a vulture. These designs were based on the Egyptian hieroglyphs, which carry religious meaning, and they were altered in the English version. The localization also changed plot details, including in the instruction manual, so the priest Aghanim became a wizard, and his background, which originally implied he was sent by the gods, was altered to remove any celestial origin. Well, finally, I want to go over to a community comment from Eden8. So I actually asked Eden8 about randomizer stuff, because I know loads of people play A Link to the Past with randomizers, and I wanted to get some information from an expert, so I did ask Eden8 to provide some information about randomizers, and Eden8 says, so with randomizer stuff, if you're interested in getting into Rando, just search A Link to the Past randomizer into Google, and the website should come up. It's got information on how to get started on rolling seeds, setting up your emulator and stuff like that. I'd also be happy to help you if you've got any questions. You know, in some ways, Randomizer makes A Link to the Past an easier game because of the locations like Kakariko Village, Paradox Cave and Hype Cave. You know, they're also item dense that you're usually going to find good items in there. And also you're able to get swords, mail, full hearts earlier than usual. It'll also randomise the dungeon prizes, so you might have 3 crystals in the Light World dungeons, and then the pendants in the Dark World, which is good because those dungeons are usually harder and longer. It takes a while to figure out the logic for those seeds, but the community is really big, often helpful and helping with stuff like this. So if you're interested in getting into randomizer stuff, just add a comment onto this video, and what I'm going to do as well, I'm going to put some links into the description. So if you're interested in getting into A Link to the Past randomizer stuff, just look in the description, or you can post your own comments down there in the comments on this video. Well, that is it for part 2 of the Zelda Game Club for A Link to the Past, and let me know in the comments what you think of the Zelda Game Club. Well, that is it for the Zelda Game Club A Link to the Past part 2, and as always, thank you so much for watching or listening. For more Legend of Zelda content like this, hit that subscribe button down below and subscribe to Triforce Times. Or you can check me out on Twitter at Triforce Times. But if you enjoyed this video, found it useful, liking and sharing the video would really help me out. Otherwise, check out the videos on the channel. Well, thanks again, and I'll see you soon.